Diane Morrison stood in her late mother's kitchen on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, surrounded by her 3 siblings, watching as they divided up what remained of Evelyn Morrison's life. At 68, Diane was the eldest of 4 children, and according to their mother's will, she'd been designated as the one to oversee the fair distribution of personal effects. The house was full of memories, 53 years of life in this cozy ranch-style home where they'd all grown up. But now Evelyn was gone, dead 3 weeks ago at 92, and the family had gathered the weekend after Thanksgiving to sort through her belongings before the house was sold. "I want the china," Diane's sister Patricia announced, already wrapping teacups in newspaper. Patricia was 65, impeccably dressed as always, her silver hair cut in an expensive style that spoke of her comfortable life in Connecticut. "Mom promised me the quilts," said Karen, the youngest at 58. She was folding the handmade quilts their mother had stitched over decades, each one a work of art. Robert, the only son at 62, was in the living room going through their father's old tools. Their father had died 15 years ago, and the tools had sat in the garage ever since, waiting for Robert to claim them. Diane moved through the room slowly, touching surfaces, opening drawers, remembering. They'd all gathered here just days ago for what turned out to be their first Thanksgiving without their mother, a somber meal filled with her absence. Now they were back to dismantle her home, and it felt too soon, too final. She wasn't interested in the valuable things her siblings were claiming. She wanted the pieces that held memory, photos, letters, small objects that would mean nothing to anyone else. In the pantry, on the top shelf behind some old cookbooks, Diane found a small wooden box. She recognized it immediately, her grandmother's recipe box. Grandma Rose had died when Diane was 12, but she remembered this box vividly. Rose Morrison had kept all her recipes in it, handwritten on index cards in her careful, slanted script. Diane pulled the box down, blowing dust off the lid. It was walnut, about 8 inches long and 5 inches deep, with a small brass clasp. She opened it, expecting to find the recipes she remembered her grandmother making, the sugar cookies, the apple pie, the famous dinner rolls they'd had at every Thanksgiving. The box was full of index cards, as expected, but as Diane began flipping through them, she realized there was something else tucked between the recipes. Loose papers, folded documents, a small leather notebook. Curious, Diane carried the box to the kitchen table and began pulling everything out. The recipes were there, Rose's handwriting stained with flour and butter, edges worn from use, but beneath them was a layer of documents that made Diane's breath catch. Business ledgers, receipts, legal papers, letters. And as Diane began reading, a story emerged that she'd never heard before. A story that changed everything she thought she knew about her family. The papers dated back to 1952. Rose Morrison, Diane's grandmother, had opened a small bakery in downtown Philadelphia. Morrison's Bakery. The ledgers showed every transaction, every expense, every dollar earned, all in Rose's handwriting. Diane stared at the pages. She'd known about Morrison's Bakery. It had been a family legend, the business her grandfather Henry had built from nothing, that had supported the family for decades, that her Uncle Frank had eventually taken over and expanded into a successful chain of 3 locations. Except according to these documents, Henry hadn't built it, Rose had. Diane pulled out more papers, business licenses, all in Rose Morrison's name. Loan documents from 1952, signed by Rose. Recipes for the bakery's signature items. Rose's cinnamon rolls, Rose's sourdough bread, Rose's apple fritters, all in Rose's handwriting, with notes about costs, pricing, production schedules. A photograph fell out from between the pages. Rose standing in front of a small storefront, wearing a white apron, holding a tray of fresh bread. The sign above her read, Morrison's Bakery, proprietor, Rose Morrison. Diane's hands shook as she kept reading. Letters from suppliers, addressed to Mrs. Rose Morrison. Newspaper clippings about the new bakery and its wonderful proprietor. A small article from 1954 highlighting local businesswoman Rose Morrison and her thriving bakery. Then the documents changed. 1956. Henry Morrison's name started appearing. legal papers transferring the business from Rose to Henry. But there was a letter, in Rose's handwriting, dated January 1956. I don't want to do this. The bakery is mine. I built it. I created every recipe. I worked every day for 4 years to make it successful. But Henry says people don't respect a woman-owned business. He says we'll get better loans, better terms from suppliers, if his name is on the papers. He promises nothing will change. I'll still run everything. It's still my bakery. But on paper, it will be his. I hope I'm not making a mistake. But he's my husband. I have to trust him. Diane felt tears burning in her eyes. She kept reading. More letters followed, chronicling the slow erosion of Rose's control. Henry making decisions without consulting her. Henry hiring managers and putting them in charge over Rose's objections. Henry taking her recipes and giving them to bakers he hired, cutting Rose out of her own kitchen. By 1959, according to a bitter entry in Rose's private ledger, she'd been reduced to working the counter while Henry ran his bakery. The business she'd built with her own hands, her own recipes, her own vision. A letter from 1960, Rose to her sister Margaret. He's taken everything, Maggie, my bakery, my recipes, my dream, and everyone thinks he built it. Everyone congratulates him on his success. No one remembers it was mine. Even our children think their father is the successful businessman and their mother is just the helpful wife. I should have fought harder. I should have never signed those papers. But what could I do? In 1956, a woman fighting her husband for control of a business? I would have lost everything. At least this way I could still work there, still be part of it, even if only at the margins. I'm documenting everything. Every recipe, every original document, every piece of proof that I built Morrison's bakery. Someday, someone should know the truth. Diane sat at the kitchen table, the recipe box's contents spread before her, and felt like she was meeting her grandmother for the first time. She'd always known Grandma Rose as a quiet woman who worked at Grandpa Henry's bakery, sweet, gentle, deferential to her husband. She'd died in 1972, when Henry was still running the business. At her funeral, people had praised Henry for letting Rose work at the bakery even though she didn't have to, for being such a good husband. But Rose hadn't been working at Henry's bakery out of his generosity. She'd been working at her own bakery that had been stolen from her by her husband, and by a society that didn't believe women could run businesses. Diane? What are you looking at? Patricia's voice broke through her thoughts. Diane looked up. Her 3 siblings had gathered in the kitchen, curious about what had captivated her attention. I found something, Diane said slowly. Something about Grandma Rose. She showed them. The documents, the ledgers, the letters, the photograph of Rose in front of her bakery. Patricia read through the papers, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock. Grandma Rose started Morrison's bakery, not Grandpa Henry? Not only started it, she built it. Every recipe, every system, everything. Grandpa Henry took it from her in 1956. Legally, with her signature, but he took it nonetheless. Robert picked up one of the ledgers, flipping through Rose's careful entries. I had no idea. I always thought Dad said his father built the bakery from nothing. That's what everyone thought, Diane said. That's what Grandpa Henry told everyone. And Grandma Rose just let the lie stand. Or maybe she tried to fight it, and no one listened. Either way, the truth got buried. Karen looked at the photograph of young Rose, proud and capable in front of her bakery. She looks so happy here. I never saw her look like that. Because by the time we knew her, she'd lost everything that made her happy, Diane said, her voice breaking. And we never knew. We never knew what had been taken from her. Patricia set down the papers carefully. What do we do with this? I don't know, Diane admitted. But we can't just put it back in the box and pretend we didn't find it. Uncle Frank still runs Morrison's bakery, Robert pointed out. Well, the 3 locations. He bought the business from Dad after Grandpa Henry died. As far as he knows, he's running Grandpa's legacy. But it's not Grandpa's legacy, Diane said firmly. It's Grandma Rose's. And Uncle Frank should know that. Everyone should know that. Patricia looked uncertain. Uncle Frank is 87 years old. Do we really want to tell him his father stole the business from his mother right after Thanksgiving? Yes, Diane said. Because Grandma Rose deserves to be remembered as who she really was. Not as Grandpa Henry's helpful wife, but as the founder of Morrison's Bakery. The real founder. The siblings sat in silence, the weight of their grandmother's hidden history settling over them. Finally, Karen spoke. We should call Uncle Frank. Invite him over. Show him everything. Right now? Robert asked. Grandma Rose kept this secret for 50 years, Diane said. She's been dead for 30 more. I think we've waited long enough to tell the truth. They called Frank Morrison, their father's younger brother. He lived 20 minutes away, and when Diane told him they'd found some papers about the bakery and wanted to share them with him, he agreed to come over immediately. Frank arrived 30 minutes later, moving slowly but still sharp-eyed at 87. He'd run Morrison's Bakery for 40 years before finally retiring 5 years ago and selling the business to a corporate chain that had kept the name and the recipes, but changed everything else. What's this about? Frank asked, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. Papers about the bakery? Diane placed the recipe box in front of him. We found this. It was Grandma Rose's. Take a look. Frank opened the box and began going through the contents. Diane watched his face as he read confusion, then shock, then something that looked like grief. He read every document, every letter, every ledger entry. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. I didn't know, he whispered. I swear to God, I didn't know. None of us knew, Diane said gently. My father told me he started the bakery in 1952, that Mom helped him, that she was a wonderful baker, but that it was his business. He was so proud of building something from nothing. Frank's voice broke. But it wasn't from nothing, it was from her. He built it on her work, her recipes, her vision, and then he took credit for all of it. Did she ever say anything? Patricia asked. Try to tell you the truth? Frank thought back, his face pained. She tried once. I remember, I must have been about 20. I was working at the bakery, and I said something about following in Dad's footsteps. Mom got this look on her face, like she wanted to say something. But Dad was right there, and he just smiled and said, Your mother's being modest. She helped too, and Mom didn't say anything else. She couldn't, Diane said. Who would have believed her over him, especially with his name on all the legal documents? Frank picked up the photograph of Rose in front of her bakery. She looked so proud here. I never saw her look like that. By the time I was old enough to remember, she just seemed diminished. Quiet, like she was trying not to take up space. Because her space had been taken from her, Karen said. They sat together, 5 people the weekend after Thanksgiving, learning the truth about a woman who'd been dead for 52 years and yet had never been fully seen while she was alive. Finally, Frank spoke. We have to fix this. I don't know how, but we have to make this right. The bakery isn't ours anymore, Robert pointed out. You sold it. But the story is ours, Frank said firmly. The truth is ours, and Grandma Rose's legacy is ours to reclaim. What are you thinking? Diane asked. Frank stood up, stronger suddenly, energized by purpose. I'm thinking it's time for Rose Morrison to get the credit she deserved. I'm thinking we tell her story. All of it. We make sure everyone knows who really founded Morrison's Bakery. Over the next 3 hours, in Evelyn Morrison's kitchen, 5 members of Rose Morrison's family hatched a plan. First, they would compile all of Rose's documents into a comprehensive history. Photos, letters, ledgers, recipes, everything that proved she'd built the bakery. Second, they would reach out to the local historical society and offer to donate Rose's papers. Her story was part of Philadelphia's business history, part of the story of women entrepreneurs who'd been erased from the record. Third, and this was Frank's idea, they would contact the current owners of Morrison's Bakery and tell them the real story, suggest that they honor the true founder. And fourth, they would work with a local journalist to write Rose's story. Not a puff piece, but a real investigation into how a woman's business was legally stolen by her husband in the 1950s, and how her family was now reclaiming her legacy. Thanksgiving seems like the right time for this, Diane said. We just spent the holiday being grateful. I'm grateful we found this. Grateful we can finally give Grandma Rose what she deserved. We can still honor her dreams, Frank said. Better late than never. They worked through the afternoon and evening. They photographed every document. They made timeline lists. They drafted letters. They called a local historian who specialized in women's history and arranged a meeting. They found the contact information for the current president of the company that now owned Morrison's Bakery. As evening fell, Diane held the photograph of young Rose Morrison, proud baker and business owner, and made her a promise. We're going to tell your story, Grandma. Everyone's going to know what you built, what was stolen from you, and what you deserved all along: recognition, respect, and credit for your own legacy. The weeks that followed brought the plan to life. The Historical Society was thrilled to receive Rose's papers and immediately began planning an exhibit about early women entrepreneurs in Philadelphia. Rose's story would be featured prominently, a cautionary tale about how women's contributions were erased, but also a celebration of her ingenuity and skill. The journalist, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in untold stories, dove into the research. She found more evidence, interviews with people who remembered the early days of Morrison's Bakery, who remembered Rose as the driving force, even after Henry's name went on the door. Old suppliers who dealt with Rose and knew she ran everything. Customers who remembered her recipes. Sarah's article ran in the Philadelphia Inquirer in late January, with the headline, "The Woman Who Built Morrison's Bakery: How Rose Morrison's Legacy Was Stolen and Reclaimed." The article was powerful, thoroughly researched, and it named names. It didn't shy away from the fact that Henry Morrison had legally taken his wife's business, or that their son Frank hadn't known the truth for decades. It was honest about the systemic barriers women faced in the 1950s, the legal structures that made it easy for husbands to control their wives' assets. But it also celebrated Rose, her creativity, her business acumen, her resilience. The response was overwhelming. Women from all over the country wrote in with their own stories of businesses stolen, ideas claimed by men, credit erased from the record. Rose's story became a catalyst for hundreds of conversations about women's invisible labor and stolen legacies. The current owners of Morrison's Bakery reached out to Frank. They wanted to make things right. They proposed renaming the flagship location Rose Morrison's Original Bakery and putting her photograph on the wall with a plaque telling her real story. They wanted to use her original recipes, the ones she'd created, that Henry had claimed. Frank negotiated one more condition: a scholarship in Rose Morrison's name for women aspiring to start their own food businesses. The company agreed, committing $50,000 annually to the Rose Morrison Entrepreneurship Scholarship. She would have loved this, Frank said to Diane at the scholarship announcement. She would have been so proud to help other women avoid what happened to her. The Historical Society's exhibit opened in March. Hidden Founders: Women Who Built Philadelphia's Businesses featured Rose Morrison prominently. Her recipe box was displayed under glass, with several of her original index cards visible, her handwriting, her stained and worn recipes, proof of her creativity and skill. Her photograph hung large on the wall, young Rose in front of her bakery, pride shining in her eyes. The caption told the full truth. Rose Morrison, founder of Morrison's Bakery, 1952. Though her husband later took credit for her work, Morrison was the true creator of the business and its signature recipes. On opening night, Diane stood in front of her grandmother's exhibit, surrounded by her siblings and Uncle Frank, and felt something she'd been carrying since that day after Thanksgiving finally settled. They'd done it. They'd reclaimed Rose's story. She would never be forgotten again, never be relegated to a footnote in her husband's story. "I wish she could see this," Karen said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Maybe she can," Patricia suggested. Frank touched the glass case holding Rose's recipe box gently. "I spent 40 years running what I thought was my father's bakery. I was so proud to carry on his legacy. And all that time, it was my mother's legacy. Her recipes, her vision, her dream. I wish I'd known. I wish I'd given her credit while she was alive." "You're giving her credit now," Diane said. "That matters." "Does it? She's been dead for 50 years. "Yes, it matters. Because now everyone knows the truth. Now young women can look at Grandma Rose and see that women were building businesses long before we acknowledged it. They can see that their contributions matter, even when they're erased. And they can learn from her story, both the tragedy of what was taken and the power of finally reclaiming the truth. The exhibit ran for 6 months and attracted thousands of visitors. Rose Morrison's story was covered by national media. Her recipe box became a symbol of women's hidden contributions, of the work that went uncredited, of the legacies that had been stolen but could still be reclaimed. Diane kept copies of all the documents, organized in a new box she'd bought specifically for this purpose. She would pass it down to her daughter, who would pass it to her daughter, so that Rose's story would never be lost again. And every Thanksgiving, Diane made Grandma Rose's dinner rolls. Not from memory, but from Rose's original recipe card, stained with butter and flour, written in that careful, slanted script. As she rolled and shaped the dough, Diane would think about Rose and her bakery at 28, creating these recipes, building a business, dreaming big dreams. Dreams that had been stolen but were now finally being honored. 1 year after finding the recipe box, Diane stood at Rose's grave with her siblings and Uncle Frank. They'd had a new headstone made. The old one had read, Rose Morrison, 1924 to 1972, beloved wife and mother. The new one read, Rose Morrison, 1924 to 1972, founder of Morrison's Bakery, beloved wife, mother, and entrepreneur. Her legacy lives on. Rest easy, Grandma, Diane said, placing a bouquet of flowers on the grave. Everyone knows now. Everyone knows what you built, what was taken from you, and what you deserved all along. You're not forgotten. You'll never be forgotten again. The November air was crisp and cool, almost Thanksgiving again. Diane thought about that weekend after the holiday, when she'd found the recipe box, how it had felt like Rose reaching out from the past, asking to be seen, to be known, to be honored. Thank you for leaving the evidence, Diane whispered. Thank you for documenting everything. Thank you for believing that someday, someone would care enough to tell the truth. The autumn leaves drifted down onto Rose Morrison's grave, onto the new headstone that finally told her real story. And somewhere, Diane hoped, Rose knew that her granddaughter had fought the battle Rose couldn't win in her lifetime. Justice, even 50 years late, was still justice. Recognition, even posthumous, still mattered. And the truth, even long buried, could still set things right. Rose Morrison had built a bakery. And 70 years later, her family had built her the monument she deserved all along, not in stone, but in the truth.